Welcome. This is session C3, Informal Urbanism and Refugee Resettlement. I think by now people are familiar with the conference format and things in our kind of virtual environment. I'm Joseph Godlewski, the chair of this session. If you're checking your program, we have one less presenter. However, that still leaves us with, I suppose, five presenters because we have a pair presenting. So we are going to start with watching Juan's presentation. Before I get into all the kind of introductions and things, I do want to let presenters and people know that there is a 20-minute limit on the presentations, and I'll try to abide by that as quickly or as accurately as possible. So I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but we will kind of move along. My role as the chair is really to foster conversation, but also to be a kind of gatekeeper and keep us on task and on time. That said, our first speaker, let me get to, as I mentioned, is Huaqing Wang. Informal placemaking at the urban-rural frontier, socio-spatial strategies in Nanjing, China. Just a little bit of background, Dr. Wang is an associate research professor in architecture at Nanjing University. He obtained a PhD from Tsinghua University and was visiting scholar at UC Berkeley and Politecnico di Milano. He's the author of the book, Subsistence in a Tea Village, the English to Chinese translator of the book Traditions, I'm sure you're all familiar, and the ethnography work, the Darjeeling Distinction from 2018. With that, I will let Dr. Wang take the floor.
Okay, thank you, Joseph. Can you hear me? Okay. So this is the full screen now, right? Okay. Okay, I will begin. Thank you, Joseph, for the introduction, and I'm so happy today to be in this panel of informal urbanism and refugee resettlements. Today I will talk about a story of informal settlements in a so-called urban village in the periphery, in the urban peripheries of Nanjing. And of course, this is a investigation, research still in progress. So today I will mainly talk about some stories and some raw materials, and I'm happy to hear from your opinions. So since the open door policy initiated in China in late 1970s, urbanization rate in China has increased from less than 20% to nearly 60% in 30 years, with dynamic spatial restructuring urban, rural, and in-between territories. The urbanization is taking place from both directions. The expansion of a central city or the reconstruction or relocation of villages in the surrounding rural area. A peri-urban village is thus a frontier where both motives of urban development and rural reconstruction meet and create dynamic territorial transformations. This paper tries to understand it based on a case study in the periphery of Nanjing. This is Dongmen Town. It's a urban village located in Pukou district in the northern edge of Nanjing. Used to be a central village in this region with active commercial activities. During recent decades, with Nanjing sprawling to the northern part of the Yangtze River, as you can see in the left corner of the map, the village has been incorporated into the constructed urban area. It might well fit into the definition of the so-called urban village, an enclave left for low-income residents and rural urban migrants. From 2006 to 2018, the town, with its low-rise building compounds, has lost more than 2/3 of its land. This process is called 拆迁 in Chinese, i.e. demolishing and relocating. Once a house is scheduled to be demolished, the government will negotiate with the owner for a price, which usually includes a compensatory apartment in a relocated residential district. However, it's not always easy to relocate all the residents. As an important commercial town in this area, Dongmen town has historically been home to a diversely mixed population, including rural urban migrants from surrounding provinces and locally elderly people who choose to stay for lower living costs and familiar neighbors. Dongmen town thus offers an ideal site to look into the social conditions of traditional urban villages within the broader urbanization agenda. By making detailed investigation into the everyday landscape, this paper seeks to answer two questions. First, why is the mixed urban-rural life in this traditional village still treasured by local residents, and how do they live it? Second, is it possible to utilize their spatial strategies in urban planning and governance to cope with the sprawling city and growing population without simply yielding to the real estate logic? With detailed anthropological and architectural fieldwork, I will investigate two spatial categories: the shared space of gathering and the shared space of living, to explore how they utilize grassroots social spatial strategies to cope with a radical transformation in traditional building environments. The site of Dongmen town is surrounded mainly by modern residential districts, but in severe lack of everyday services. Dongmen town has thus taken on this commercial role. In the core of the town, there is a cross-shaped commercial street which enjoys a history of centuries. The east-west going one used to be the longest historical street in Nanjing, with a great part extending west, which we could no longer see. Today, it not only sells everyday food and groceries, but also offers the best opportunity to run into old neighbors. That's why, with fewer customers coming here, the street still attracts local residents here. One of their gathering space is nothing but an empty land in front of a house. The owner of the house, Miss Liu, is apparently a nice old lady. She's lonely, probably, as she puts her own sofa and several chairs and stools outside her room, extending her living space to the public realm. This public living room, as we might call it, is occupied most of the day. She told me, neighbors like to come here just to kill time, especially when kids are at school during the day. If weather permits, we also bring our lunch and dinner to share. More intriguingly, the farmers market is another destination for the local residents, who do not only come for shopping, but also for selling. A key part of this open-air market is a bridge, occupied by local resident elderly women who sell a small amount of local vegetable. The vegetable they sell may vary from day to day, and they do not seem eager to do business at all. As Miss Zhang, a decently dressed old lady, told me, I live in a residential district nearby. My son lives with me and works in the city. I do not need to make money at all, but vending vegetable is a good way for me to kill time. Another lady, Miss Li, described her daily routine in details. Every day at 6 p.m., I go to a place nearby to collect natural vegetables from the land. Around 7 to 8 a.m., I arrive here and start the business. At noon, I go back home for lunch. In the afternoon, I return here again and stay until 5 p.m. when I go back for supper. I sometimes come here again in the evening just to chat with the neighbors. From these retired ladies, a small business in the community is not so much a way of subsistence, but a key source of gaining company. It almost seemed like a job for them. Meanwhile, it also allowed them to gain relative economic independence in their family. There are also other rural migrants who run restaurants in the market. As Mr. Liu, a middle-aged Cook from Anhui province told us, quote, "My family came to Nanjing 5 years ago. My son and my daughter both work in the city during daytime. Me and my wife run this restaurant, and the children will come back to help during the evening. How is the business?" I asked. "Not so good, as there are less and less residents here. Around 8 p.m., we could close this restaurant and open a small food stand outside, mainly for those returning late from work," unquote. In terms of spatial strategies, the stretching of waterproof clothes around the street corner is one of the ways to create a semi-public space. It allows the small business owners like Mr. Liu to compete in the market with a lower price. And in this urban-rural mixture, the indigenous residents, urban and rural migrants live with mutual benefits. One's business might be the other's subsistence. The old town provides not only space of socializing and commercializing, but also the most basic conditions of housing. The low-cost housing strategies in the neighborhood is based on the reorganization of the traditional courtyards in this region, which could measure about 70 meters in length and 12 meters in width. They used to be built by wealthy merchants in the town. The low rents of the houses keep attracting people from different backgrounds to form an intact community to cope with the increasing population in the metropolitan area. In House A, we find two solitude old ladies sharing the house together. Miss Zhang is one of the owners of the house. She used to live with her children in the city, but when the Chai Qian policy was announced, she moved back here on her own to make sure her family get the best bargain from the government. Her life is very simple. She tries to minimize the living space to save trouble. Miss Kong is a migrant from the city, since her own house has been demolished and still waiting to be relocated. The government offers a subsidy of 600 yuan, about $100 per month for her transitional period, but this amount is only enough to rent a small room in this village. Except for a bedroom and a living room, her kitchen and bathroom are housed in a temporary shed in the courtyard. Both Miss Zhang and Miss Kong seem to be quite introverted. Except for regular housework, they stay in separate bedrooms and watch TV for most of the day. As we might say, the unclear demolition policy has stopped them from embracing a new life. The co-housing prototype is much more condensed in House B. It is a very big house and accommodates 3 families, a local one and 2 rural migrant families. The gradual additions to the house have created a public land in the middle of the house, running all the way from east to west. The land has 2 major functions. One is to provide a path for the different families. Second is to offer everyday living experience. These facilities are usually temporary and flexible. For example, a kitchen is just a table with a stove, and a dining room could be a table and several stools by the wall. The portable installations in the public land allow the residents to utilize the space with flexibility. As we can see in Mr. He's home, who has 12 members in his family. He and his brother-in-law's family have separate dining rooms, but they cook and eat together most of the times. He told me, quote, "My brother is quite busy at work at the construction sites. I just work here in the town, so I cook for all of them. Anyway, it's more lively to have dinner with such a big family," unquote. Unlike House A, the 3 families in House B enjoy a relatively lively and harmonious shared life. This public land has thus become a linear public hall, as we can call it, which embodies the everyday experience of a co-housing community. Finally, we could have a few discussions. Viewed as a dying village by the outsiders, Dongmen Town reveals its lively social spatial life despite changes brought by the demolishing and relocating policy. It not only provides crucial everyday facilities for those income residents, but also offers vivid strategies to the regeneration and reconstruction in a larger urban context. The living space, either the public space of gathering or the private houses for share, is the key that maintains the social bonds within the traditional community. However, the lived experience of this grassroots community has not received much attention in the urbanization process. The loss of this communal space could bring potential threats to the safety, health, and stability of not only a resident himself, but also the community as a whole. For example, some informal market space, as shown before, is not only daily subsistence, but also a way of gaining company and economic independence for elderly people. Apparently, there are valuable lessons we could learn from the grassroots spatial strategies in those urban villages like Dolmen Town. At last, it might also give rise to a more intact understanding of house equity in urban planning and governance. Housing equity for all, especially the low-income population, not only means equalized spatial organization in traditional planning topics like minimum floor area per capita, accessible transportation, and the provision of public facilities, but also calls for greater attention to secure the social intactness of the community. The urban village, with its full existence or its social spatial strategies, thus contributes to an alternative path for urbanization and rural reconstruction in contemporary China. Thank you for your listening.
Watching, thank you. That was very clear. I appreciate the drawings and diagrams, especially. I failed to mention the beginning at the outset, just as a kind of general rule, we tend to keep questions and comments until after all the presentations. But again, thank you for presenting on time and within the given frame. That said, I will move directly to our second presenter, which is Pamini Chaiwat, Virtual Investigations, Place Identity and Perceptions of Refugee Resettlement in Utica, New York, which is so interesting, a global conference and all these kind of global locales. And here's a presentation that's very, very close to me as I'm kind of zooming in here from Syracuse, New York, which is very close to Utica, and shares a lot of similarities, actually. At that, Pamini Chaiwat is interested in examining roles of architecture as a manifestation of identity and its social impacts in promoting equity and spatial justice. Her research investigates refugee resettlement and inclusivity at U.S. refugee receiving cities. She holds a Master of Architecture degree from the University of Washington, Seattle. And currently she's pursuing her PhD in architecture at the University of Oregon, something of a theme to this session. With that, I will allow Pamini to take the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen. So in this presentation, I will talk about virtual investigation of refugee resettlement in Utica. And in this picture, I just want to give you a glimpse of how mobile phone become a part of migration or fleeing journey of many refugees in this time. Like even though they have to abandon many things, the mobile device become the things that navigate them through all the escaping journey. And in this research, we will see how do they use social media platform as part of their daily life and how it reflects their resettlement journey. So in this research, I examine the relationship between literature and social media, which is Twitter information. I asked how the social media become a virtual space for refugee community that reflect their everyday experience after their resettlement. I investigate. I did the literature review for place and integration, and then for the Twitter data, I used the keyword of Utica and refugee to refine to filter all the tweets and extract those tweets to see to analyze it. Then the case of Utica that I would like to talk to you more. Why do I choose this place in Utica, New York? So Utica, New York is an upstate town, a Rust Belt city, which kind of declined from like once the industrial decline, then the population also migrate out, make the city in a kind of like a rundown town until in 1970s that the city start to receive refugee from Bosnia and Vietnam and other Southeast Asian country. So currently the population of the town is about 60,000. Well, with over than 10% of population in that town has a refugee background. In this map, you can see that from such a small town in upstate New York, it's connected to other 4 continents, Europe, Asia, Africa, South America, and think of the cultural diversity of this place is very, very rich and unique case. So in the literature review, like looking at home as a place and meaning. So I will just give a summary of the literature review. In this, we start with what does place mean? And the many literature has pointed out to refugee home and house, and it identified 2 strains, which is physical space and symbolic meaning. Then the physical space itself can break down into home ownership and community and neighborhood. Then it's mentioned about accessibility, stability, safety and security, and housing quality, which direct to the idea of affordability, integration, and diversity. Then in terms of symbolic meaning, it means the part of restore normality, the permanentness of a settlement, and then transcend and connectedness of people. Another strand of literature is about integration, which I choose to show the kind of summary of the framework of integration from Egger and Strang, 10 domains of integration within the 4, organized into 4 categories of mean and marker, social connection, facilitator, and foundation. Means and marker are the most obvious thing that we can see in the implication of work in terms of policy, in terms of real physical space. These are employment, housing, education, and health. And this original indicator of integration framework has been augmented to include leisure space, and the facilitator also expand to include digital skills besides the language and cultural communication, safety and stability. So in this part, I would like to connect and compare it to between the Twitter data and literature. On the left-hand side, we run the word frequency that extract from Twitter data. The Twitter is a platform that launched in 2006. So in this case, well, which I use 2 keywords of Utica and refugee, I can extract 1,167 tweets that include these 2 keywords, date back to 2006 until 2020. And when we run the word frequency, these are the frequency of words that show up in this word cloud. And other words that kind of pops up is family, 250 times in 1,000 tweets. Community, 200 times. School, 150. Center, 150. Business, 120. Sanctuary, 120. homeowner 120 times, family belongs together 120 times. And in the literature, I feed all the literature that I review and have create an algorithm that run the word frequency of those literature. And these are the words that frequently pops up: integration, segregation, housing, social, policy, local, different, refugee, migrant, neighborhood, opportunities. So maybe the connection might not be clear now, but let me show you the next slide. Then another method that I process or analyze the tweet data is to identify word co-occurrence, which create a network of words that appears together, and try to see the cluster and theme and pattern. That's what are these tweet try to say, because tweet is aggregate data that I try to understand what all of these 1,000 tweet, what do people are saying, right? So with this cluster of word co-occurrence, there are themes that show up, like background experience of refugee, the way they disseminate and public participation, the way they express their political opinion. And also in this thing, you can start seeing like anxiety pops up in their political expression. We see problematic issues about segregated student, banned lawsuit in a district, a school district. So public participation, we can see the celebrate, the word celebrate, the word World Day, celebration, event, and then specifically to some group that has more voice in a social platform like Bosnian, which resettle in Utica since 1970. They have words like community, Muslim, Bosnian, hometown. So once we start to cluster these words, we see the thematic patterns that arise. Then we connect these patterns to understand the word center that pops up very often. What does it mean? The center in this case linked to a physical space of the Center Mohawk Valley Resort Center for Refugee, which actually has a big role in disseminating information to this population. And that's one of the reasons that they use tweet as a platform to connect to their larger audience. Housing that pops up, but housing is something that is very, even though it pops up in terms of like policy of home ownership, it doesn't pops up in the way that shows everyday experience of their housing. So in this picture, you see a decline housing in Utica that refugee who resettle in the city start revival it and renovate it to make it livable again. Another example is from ethnic marker, which in this case a former Central United Methodist Church, which become an ethnic marker for Bosnian refugee. This church has been bought for $1,000 and turned into a mosque in the downtown Utica, and it's also obvious that they mention about it in their social media platform. And next, another one is about the way they participate or they express their opinion about refugee in Utica, which is like their events related to the welcoming refugee, a running event for refugee, World Refugee Days that all happens in Utica. And especially when the town is given the name of a town, Utica, the town that loves refugee by United High Commission of Refugee. So the residents take pride in their diversity and how they welcome refugee population. So comparing what happens here to literature, we can see that like the way they mention that settlement of family unification is related to housing, and the problematic issue of school segregated a problem is within the education domain, or employment is related to business. There are correlation between these two sets of data. However, like it might not be, there are some limitation in this study, as because how I just like start this one as my pilot study, and I want to restrict put a restriction to myself that I can do all the coding properly. So then I choose to Utica is an interesting case, but then there's a limitation on how much really people use and access these social media platform. Social media platform seems to be a way to disseminate information and rather than the way people express their daily life experience. Even though there are correlating themes, the tone is different in these two sets of data. The literature express it in a more theory and policy ways, while the set of tweet are actual activities, might not be daily, might be like a special event and celebration, but they have mood and tone within the information. Then we look back at the how the digital landscape take part in the daily life. So it's become source of information to survive and integrate. Like in this picture, we see a girl with her mother looking at the cell phone as migrant waiting for registration. Smartphones have been created to help refugee find work, obtain residency permit, and open bank account, and do many other daily routine. It has a potential of access and share information, stay connected with family, facilitate adaptation to the new context, help refugee to survive the difficult situation, or provide escape information. Then it's also has a risk of being traced. Is allow refugee to create bonding and bridging in social capital, and also favor personal empowerment and promote well-being and education, like using it as a translation. However, like with these option that provide necessity, then like what does it mean by the necessity of place, a physical place? Will we need it anymore? So when I compare this, we as I explained, the literature show a big picture of policy and theory, and tweet present a case-specific activity and atmosphere. But then it's go back to how can we utilize the big data, do big data mining in a way that we can relate and understand people in a daily experience, how to find a right keyword. I use two keywords of Utica and refugee, but nobody will tweet refugee every day. So we have to understand, like we have to understand the nature of written language in a social media platform, and also overcome a barrier of language limitation. People can tweet in other language. What about other people that we left behind using this method? But I find that this is a good starting point to understand the digital platform that create a different landscape than a physical platform, and it reduce the necessity of physical space and increase the expansion and expand the virtual platform. So yes, So this is my investigation on the virtual platform and literature and physical space. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamini, for your presentation. Also, again, for staying on time. Yeah, I have a bunch of questions about that, but I'm going to save them until the end. I think with that, we should move to our next set of presenters. Lindsay Deaton, many of you know, and James Miller. Their presentation is titled Community Displacement and How Sociospatial Traditions in Filipino and Marshallese Culture Are Transposed on New Landscapes. As a kind of background, Lindsay Deaton is a licensed architect and urban planner with projects across the United States, the Middle East, or the Middle and Far East and Africa. She serves as the Associate Director at Urban Design Lab at the University of Oregon, where she recently obtained her doctorate degree. Her current research is an international study of marginalized kids' social spaces and communities affected by architectural mega projects in order to reconcile urban patterns and policies with kids' spatial needs. Dr. James Miller is an assistant professor in comparative Indigenous studies with a joint appointment in Canadian American Studies, LHC studies at the Huxley College of the Environment, Western Washington University. A Kanaka Maoli scholar, architect, and urbanist, James is the director of a design lab, Aiki Hanua. Am I saying that correctly? Because I kept confronting it. I was like, how do I pronounce this correctly?
Ike.
Ike. Okay, Ike. Centering Indigenous knowledge and building resilient communities through architectural and planning frameworks. Miller's most recent publications include Post-Disaster Recovery Through the Evolution of the Laku, a Traditional Settlement Pattern, published in the International Journal of Disaster Resilience in the Built Environment. With that, I will let our presenters take the floor.
All right, thank you, Joseph, for the introductions. All right, can everyone see the slides? At least.
Yeah, looks
All right,
good.
great. All right, just go ahead and begin. So the Republic of the Philippines and the Republic of the Marshall Islands are two Pacific island nations that have been the site of centuries of colonization, agricultural exploitation, and wartime decimation, forcing marginalized populations to repeatedly resettle and concentrate in and around urban centers. Our paper traces two of these resettled communities in order to investigate the objectives of cultural assimilation in contrasting resettlement morphologies. While we will elaborate on the relevance of the historical context and emphasize the cultural stakes in our paper, we won't be able to go into as much detail in the presentation. So ask lots of questions. So we would like to focus on the methodology and our conclusion that suggests adaptations in resettlement architecture show resistance to the traditions of assimilation. We believe this work is especially relevant to the ISD community, as architectural adaptations hold an important possible resurgence of cultural patterns. And to begin, we'd like to start our presentation by recognizing subaltern perspectives of these island peoples and how important it is for researchers to contextualize their work as such. So to read this excerpt from a poem by Brandy Nalani McDougall, it evokes the theoretical stakes at play in resettlement. So try to tell them to let go of the new rings, marking each passing year, to abandon their only home and move on. I can't pretend there is no memory held in the dried coconut hat, the star ornament, the midribs bent and dangling away from their roots. No thought behind the kavelevele that continues to hold us steady. There was a time before they were bent under their need to make an honest living, when each frond was bound by its life to another like a long, erect fin skimming the surface of a sea of grass and sand. An excerpt from Hemele Aloha no Niu. So the communities that we worked with have long held meaning in their built environment, and thus the destruction, reproduction, and adaptation of the environment, especially through the informal means, is an important place of the transcribed meaning.
So our goal in this presentation is really to share with you two stories of forced resettlement. And then we're going to reveal how a comparison of the residents' experiences illuminates themes of resistance. So our first story comes from the indigenous people of the Republic of Marshall Islands, where there's a decentralized bottoms-up resettlement of families returning to their heritage land following the withdrawal of the American military occupation on Uliga, which is an ethnic-based resettlement under the regime of military imperialism that essentially attempts to assimilate residents into a very Western way of life. Our second story comes from the informal urban communities around Manila, Philippines, where the centralized top-down resettlement of families from the Metro Manila area to the planned social housing development of Pabahay 2000 is more of a form of class-based resettlement under the regime of neoliberal capitalism, and that attempts to assimilate residents into a mortgage system. So a similarity in these stories is the way in which the built environment reflects the political and cultural vectors of power in each community. As a concept, resettlement has been historically tied to nationalist programs like the US's New Deal or China's expansionist programs. And it's also been used as a masking label for Nazi Germany's deportation of Jewish people. Architectures like the Hull House in Chicago and the post-war tract homes in LA were very centralized attempts to assimilate immigrants into the norms of a white middle-class America. While the architectures of assimilation are predominantly associated with refugee movements, in this paper, we work with concepts that are not specific to the transnational movements that are characteristic of the refugee movements. And we do this in part by establishing a broad definition as the process or act of moving people from one place to another. And we resist the temptation to identify a central agent as being responsible for a movement. I think that, we think that in broadening this term, we're really able to investigate a nuanced implication of many hegemonic agendas on the indigenous populations, along with their responses to urban conditions. And this broader definition then draws increasing importance as in climate change leads us towards mass global movements of communities around the world. Describing the process of resettlement as a mechanism of assimilation in these two cases in the Philippines and RMI allows us to frame individual acts of adapting architecture as a form of resistance to answer the question, how do architectural adaptations show resistance in Uliga and Pabahay 2000? Stories, we believe, are best understood by listening to the people within each community. Although qualitative work such as this is often criticized as imprecise or being speculative, we really advocate that qualitative methods can be a rigorous science when appropriate for the topic of investigation and when they've been rigorously triangulated. There's a process of scientific discovery that builds theories, and it really holds the potential, we believe, to reveal subaltern themes that have been hidden by numbers or statistics. So our methodology, therefore, it seeks to understand the questions more of how and why architectural adaptations show resistance. We selected these cases because they both present stark urban conditions that have been shaped by policies and developmental processes of neoliberal capitalism. And they both have morphologies that have been heavily shaped by American colonial influences. In both cases, the authors, us, James and I, used qualitative analysis of built form, we used spatial analysis, we used ethnographic studies. But as each case presented very unique cultural context, additional methods were used to iteratively investigate the themes specific to those cases. So James is going to start first and talk to you about RMI.
All right, so Elang Kainad, or the Republic of the Marshall Islands, consists of two island chains, the Rallick and the Ratic. So we're not showing a geographic map. It's approximately halfway between Hawaii and Australia, with 29 atolls and 5 islands. It was first settled during the Austronesian expansion. Elang Kainad is part of Micronesia and was first settled roughly 2,000 years ago. Land division in the Marshall Islands is shaped by the Watteau, which is defined by matrilineal inheritance. The Watteau is essentially a slice from the lagoon to the ocean side of an islet. The Watteau represents the land parcel connecting ocean to lagoon and all the resources in between, including access to freshwater lands. And then, as mentioned, it's passed down from the mother, matrilineal inheritance, providing again access to all the resources in the atoll ecosystem. In the RMI, 4 phases, loosely or roughly 4 phases of social changes took place under colonization. These are the introduction of essentially the market economy, market capitalism, beginning with early European settlement, then Christianization between period really from 1850 to the present, military imperialism under Japanese occupation, as well as the United States occupation following World War II, and now period of neocolonialism under the Compact of Free Association from 1986 to the present. The most drastic and lasting impacts to these phases on the built environment of the Marshall Islands, so built environment, not necessarily the cultural implications, has been the US occupation and really continued US occupation, which led to the socio-cultural changes in housing driven by US development programs, the mass displacement of Marshallese communities from their ancestral lands, in particular during the nuclear proving ground era, and the rapid urbanization of Madro Atoll. So while resettlement occurred throughout the continued habitation in the Marshall Islands, mostly due to typhoons, nearly all cases of forced displacement in the past century have been due to the United States occupation. Resettlement schemes were adopted for the US nuclear proving grounds, such as with Bikini and Inuit communities, and the impacts of these forced relocations continue to influence patterns of resettlement today. In addition, communities across the islets of Kwajalein were resettled to Ipai Kwajaleins, where the USAG base is. And the focus of this study is on the displacement and resettlement of families, particularly impacted by the UN Trust Territories headquarters, which was located on Ulaga Islet in Madro Atoll. So with all these movements of Marshallese communities, it's important to emphasize the significance of family relations. With the prioritization of development on Ulaga, Jarrett, and Dalip, under the UN Trust Territories to the Pacifics, headquarters in Madro, these relatively resource-poor islets had gained financial capital and symbolic power in RMI due to the legacy of the Trust Territory. The infrastructure development by the US military, including the airstrip provided the DoD, Jarrett, Ulaga, Dalip, key ingredients for urbanization. As the RMI exited the Trust Territory of the Pacific, a transnational period took place during the late 1980s and early 1990s. And during this time, Hawaii architects and engineers were hired to provide a full-scale development scheme for the DoD. The airstrip was moved from the urban center, and development schemes for a medium-density suburban center were designed for Dalip, inclusive of housing, retail, and a movie theater. The retail housing, parts of the housing were developed, the retail's there. The movie theater unfortunately closed about 15 years ago. As RMI entered independence, land holdings on Dalip, Ulaga, and Jarrett became a vital asset as the rightful landowners resettled their ancestral lands, gaining a place in the new urban center of the RMI and prime real estate in a globalizing world. While remadral families did not assimilate to the American ideologies of land ownership, arguably those ideologies had an impression. The focus of this research again is on Ulaga, and in particular, looking at the Lejoliman Watteau. Which once supported officer housing, barracks, the water tower, tennis courts, and a commissary. And between 1977 and the mid-1990s, the rightful landowners began to reoccupy their land holdings in Ulaga. And this period marked the transition from the US Administrative Center into a re-identified martial lease space. As described earlier, the value of these lands shifted drastically from subsistence resources to real estate value due to their location in the new economic center. Between the mid-1980s and 1990s, Ulaga was rapidly developed as families began to adapt to the existing building stock and construct new housing units for extended families that were also moving into Ulaga from outer atolls to take advantage of the urban economy. The figure here provides a visualization of these rapid changes over time through figure ground drawings. In 1967, buildings and hard surfaced areas made up approximately 30% of land use, while 70% was open space, consisting of agroforestry and recreation space. By 2020, buildings and hard surfaced areas consumed 80% of the land, leaving approximately 20% of open space for agroforestry and recreation. So this drastic change in land shifted the identity with land from natural sustenance and abundance to the economic sustenance and abundance. Americatown, the other name for Ulaga, reflected the idyllic suburban housing of California and Hawaii in the Marshall Islands. So this is an image of a typical officer housing in Ulaga and the American suburban aesthetic in Ulaga. The plan that I'll show next highlights the original footprint of a 3-bedroom officer house at the center of the parcel. Again, this is Ledrilla Minuato, demonstrating the adaptation that has taken place over time after Marshallese families reclaimed their ancestral lands. The house is now the home of the Alep, which is the traditional landowner on the Wato. And it is now referred to as Isodonia. The family's kind of renamed their urban space, influenced by Americanization. The buildings to the east and west of the house are used primarily for rentals, with a pool hall and shop facing the main street to the south. And there's a cookhouse along the seawall to the north, in addition to a second outdoor kitchen adjacent to the indoor kitchen. And the cookhouse is a small space for a fire, where generally local foods, traditional Marshallese foods, are cooked. So here's that plan. 3 important patterns emerge within the everyday practices of this family, and each demonstrate an evolution of indigenous knowledge that aids the cultural continuity in the urban environment. These patterns are land, or enra, or land, enra meaning is a Marshallese concept of sharing, and multi-generational inhabitation. And part of the multi-generational inhabitation is the dissemination of knowledge from elders to the youth. We argue that these patterns illustrate resistance to the assimilative forces of the American housing and planning schemes occupying the DUD, and the resurgence of these cultural patterns demonstrate cultural structures that have continued in the construction of culturally supportive space throughout the evolution of the Marshallese culture, and are evidence of resistance to logics of Western planning. While it has been argued that the predominant settlement pattern in Madro has been replaced by the nuclear family represented by the single family home, it's not clear to what extent this assessment is accurate, in particular when cases like this are predominant. Housing development has increased on Watos, leading to increased density and the perceived increase of single family homes, but this also correlates with population growth and the rural to urban migration. It's not clear that these housing shifts in the RMI correlate directly to a predominance of the nuclear family settlement pattern. And the 3 patterns discussed here point to the persistence of Marshallese settlement patterns in spite of the development of single family homes following a predominant American settlement pattern. So analyzing emergent patterns through ethnographic data demonstrates that even families with a series of single family homes on their Wato carry forward Marshallese cultural and spatial practices, such as ENRA, multi-generational housing, and land use.
All right, so everybody in this session, we're going to get on our figurative airplane and fly back over to the Philippines now.
And get on the island hopper.
Yeah, we're getting a little island hopper. So everybody's aware, just to give you a reference, Philippines, also an archipelagic country. It has so many islands, like over 7,500 islands in the Western Pacific. The most populous and pretty similar urban development morphology to many of the archipelagic countries. There's one central island that has most of the population located in one central city. And in the Philippines, that's Metro Manila. And the country's overall global geographic position makes it just kind of right on the ring of fire. So it's got devastating earthquakes as well as typhoons. So in addition to the colonial influences, there's a lot of geographic influences that have also led to this kind of displacement resettlement back and forth over the past few centuries. But I really think that that scholars have done well to point out that the economic factors resulting from Spanish and American colonization, like urban to rural or rural to urban migration, ethnic violence, and land appropriation, are probably the most frequently cited reasons for resettlement in this island nation. And historically, the process of resettlement has largely been attributed to the relocation of families informally relocated to occupy lands without legal rights and then moved into subsidized or socialized government housing. Resettlement overall has become an embedded process in the island nation, starting with kind of the imbalance of resources in that colonial landowning elite, tenant farmer form, all the way through to present. And today, the Philippines, like many South Asian countries, it's trying to leverage the economic potential of urban space, especially in the capital of Manila, but really using a neoliberal ideology. And so I really try to point that out in the paper and bring a lot of attention to neoliberal capitalism as a impetus for the newer resettlement regimes as being very distinct from the former regimes of colonialism, but also the kind of geographic and environmental reasons. The Philippines has such a stark and sensational display of social housing as being an embedded political process. And in our paper, James and I really talk a lot about the importance of the history in developing the current context. And when I talk about the Philippines in the paper, I go into a lot of detail about, for lack of a better word, like the ridiculousness of the presidential platforms and how they use social housing to gain the votes of this large population of informal residents. But really how they don't actually make a whole lot of progress in addressing the issue, despite all the attention and all the money kind of funneling into that. And that's really due to this idea of constant turnover of housing agencies. Every time there's a new president, there's a whole new political structure about how social housing is going to be addressed. And it really renders very little material change, and it renders a lot of swings in design ideas and in project management strategies. But I think in analyzing all of them, they all focus on this idea of the sheer number and quantity of houses that are produced over a qualitative assessment of day-to-day life, ergo quality of life. As a measure of a success. So over the past 3 decades, social housing has really transitioned many times. And I think that you could categorize earlier decades as seen as a public responsibility in kind of more of a socialist era. And today it's considered an opportunity to be leveraged for private industry. And there's a lot more engagement of the private industry in social housing in the Philippines. And so I focus in on this one Pabahay 2000, this one resettlement community, but it's a mass resettlement community of over 7,000 families that's been relocated from central Manila to the edge of Manila. And I think it's important, I get all geeked out on Google Earth. I'm sure everybody here does. So we all kind of might have an idea of what the cities look like. And I think architects are, they more often like to view things in terms of actual distances. But I don't think that that's necessarily appropriate in this context, because distance in Metro Manila, when we say the urban periphery, it's not just about numbers of kilometers, it's really about how quickly you can get through traffic. Because if you've ever been to Manila, you know that the traffic there is absolutely insane. So even though as the crow flies, this community is probably only 15 to 20 kilometers from downtown Manila, and it still looks like it's very much kind of on the edge of an urban fabric. In practice, it would take me a minimum of 4 hours to get from where I was living, which was not even in the center of Manila, which was more on the outskirts, just to this resettlement community. And as you can imagine, a 4-hour daily commute, if you're trying to get to a job or something, is completely impossible. Public transportation to these kind of urban periphery areas is very limited. It's limited to commercial centers, which are not where these residents were located. So most people have to use different combinations of private transport and jeepneys and rickshaws, but all of those kind of more informal means of transportation are not really equipped to deal with heavy flooding. And in a lot of these areas, especially due to the hardscaping of Manila, the flooding gets pushed back to the agricultural areas that are not as equipped with underground infrastructure. So you've got issues of accessibility due to limited services, due to just the sheer geographic distance, and to the quality of infrastructure that are really major concerns. On the left in this image, you see a figure ground of Pabahai 2000 based on field surveys that I did in 2018. And then on the right, you're looking at a site plan from some of the original construction documents that were developed in 1995. The residents of this community came from a few different locations. Some were from informal land in Metro Manila area when the government leased land to this mall company called SM. And so they developed a commercial shopping center. So essentially, the community was invited in to occupy land in Manila in this kind of socialist era as a presidential platform. But then when the city saw an opportunity to redevelop that land and sell it to a private developer for commercial gain, they folded in the resettlement cost in the development deal and had the company pay for the relocation of these people outside of the city in order to develop it into a commercial center. So I think that there's a lot of issues that I go into more in the paper about the family bonds that are broken with relocation, about the lottery system that's used to assign housing, about the formality, informality boundary that keeps going back and forth when during resettlement of trying to prove that you really were an informal settler to then get formal rights. But the bottom line is that the residents of Pabahai 2000 have serious concerns that they vocalized many times, from lack of safety, issues of safety, lack of childcare and support, needs of financial support because they don't have that community capital because they weren't relocated together. They were kind of hodgepodge relocated with a lottery system. The community overall was constructed in 1998, which made it great for me to come back 20 years later and actually talk with the families about how that experience was. And I think we're going to look at some of the architectural adaptations and adjustments that were done to the units in attempt to make this community then fit their actual needs. The community is only accessible through a two-way loop. You can kind of see it in the center. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but it's right here. That dead ends into a private gated community. And other than from the very cramped and inhumane density, it's kind of hard to tell from the architecture at this point, 20 years later, that this community was originally designed as a resettlement housing community. So while Pabahai 2000 was not technically one of these presidential campaign communities. The essential principles of economic efficiency were very clear in the planning documents that lay out the 7,000 plus units on just 100 acres. I mean, that number is incredible to me. The company, Philinvest, that designed the houses made basically each house the exact same. There was one single floor plan in the CD set. So it didn't matter about the orientation to the street, to the sun, to wind directions. That was not really something that was considered. Essentially, these houses are organized for how many you can fit on this size of property. So they're just dense rows of 20 houses that share a party wall between each unit. There's a 3-foot overhang on the front side and the back side of the units. And the rear house, the rear of the unit was a space that families ended up constructing some steps or ramps to bring that entry above street level because of the flooding that was regularly happening during the monsoon seasons. The front of the units share a boundary with the street. The rear units share a boundary with a 7-foot wide alley. So really it's an alley, but it's just barely able to be used for kind of walking and then maybe storage of stuff. It's not really used as a space, a functional space. There is one area in the entire community of 7,000 families. And granted, just a side note, a family in the Philippines in this context is about 5 to 7 people. So multiply 7,000 by 5 to 7, like 35,000, 42,000 people living on 100 acres. There's one public space and it is a basketball court, but there are no public spaces of open space like parks or anything that would engage nature, or even kind of the in-between informal public spaces like a sidewalk or something that people could gather on. Today, most of the units have undergone at least one renovation, with many units on their 5th or 6th complete overhaul renovation. So these pictures you see, the 1 through 6, these are those same single one-room units that share the party wall that have been renovated. So you can see that they look completely different, but these were all the same fundamental bone structure. Lots have been combined, divided, and raised. Property has mostly been sold to enterprising neighbors or to people that lived in the larger community, or even out-of-town investors. When I interviewed the National Housing Authority and asked them to estimate how many are of today's residents are actually in need of social housing, they said they didn't really have a number, but they estimate around 40% of people that actually hold the title would qualify for social housing today. So the community has completely morphed into an actual functioning town, right? It started out with just housing and one basketball court. There was no commercial, there was no districting. It was out in the middle of an agricultural field. And today, there's a diversity of uses. You've got schools, liquor stores, bakeries, computer cafes, restaurants, poultry supply, resale shops, water filling stations. So people have really turned these houses from the single room, single level layout to a medium density, mid-rise constructed community. And I feel like these adaptations hint at a transition of to a grassroots model, which I feel like in a way speaks to Joaquin Wang's first presentation in our session about the importance of grassroots in developing public space in Nanjing, China. So I was just thinking, Joaquin, maybe we need to put a paper together later. Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. All right, so to come to our conclusions, the entrenched logics of colonialism were put into place to erase the indigenous. The techno power of planning as a process erases through the cycles of dispossession and resettlement that assimilate populations. Although much of the discourse is rooted in the cycles of claiming, reclaiming indigenous lands, these patterns transfer to the context of developing states through their intentions to assimilate families, into the norms of Western culture, or in this case, American culture. The two cases in this study demonstrate different resettlement approaches, top-down versus bottom-up, and that both utilize the technology of planning to achieve cultural assimilation. In Ulaga, the decommissioned cantonment was the framework for a grassroots resettlement process of families returning to ancestral lands, whereas in Pabahai 2000, the federal government forcibly resettled families from informal communities in Metro Manila to social housing on the urban periphery. Our qualitative investigation revealed patterns of architectural adaptation in both cases, demonstrating resistance to assimilation. As a process, the unplanned resettlement of indigenous people to reclaim their heritage land in Ulaga contrasts with the centrally planned resettlement of informal communities to move into social housing in Pabahai 2000. However, we found similarities in the ways in which the individual families have adapted the architecture of their dwellings to resist assimilation, as we've explained. Just as many families in Ulaga continue cultural housing patterns through adaptations, so too do many families in Pabahai adapt their housing units to resist the constraining efficiencies of neoliberal planning, as Lindsay so well defined.
So in conclusion, as an embodiment of everyday practice, we think that architectural adaptations show resistance to assimilation, and they demonstrate the agency of the inhabitants. If we broaden that definition of resettlement and allow for the investigation of nuanced implications of hegemonic agendas on these subaltern populations, along with their responses to urban conditions, it really allows us to see more and understand these trans political movements. So instead of focusing specifically on refugee populations and those transnational politics, our intention was really to explore how resistance manifests in architecture. So we took the suggestion of Lozanovska, to follow the perception of assimilation and how it was experienced through the day-to-day lives of the residents in these two communities. And we considered questions of how assimilation occurs and how it's resisted in the paper. We explored different types of resettlement processes. James looks at decentralized in Ulaga, and I looked at a centralized process in the Philippines through these case studies. And we found that commonalities in the manifestation of these architectural adaptations. In RMI, families who resettled in order to reclaim heritage lands rejected the assimilating architecture of the decommissioned military outpost in Ulaga. They made architectural adaptations to demonstrate their agency over implied Western lifestyles for which the buildings were actually designed. In the Republic of the Philippines, informal settler families were forcibly resettled to that community way outside of Manila, Pabahai 2000. And over a 20-year period, these families made architectural adaptations that rejected a very neoliberal planning logic of an austere and very homogeneous environment. And we think that these findings suggest a possible resurgence of cultural patterns, but this possibility is a little difficult to explore in the case of the Philippines, where informal settlers are resettled through that lottery system I mentioned earlier that really redistributes ethnic groups and the ties that families have back to the original islands that they've come from and migrating to the city. So exploratory and theory building work in the field of resettlement architecture, James and I really think that that's critical now more than ever, especially in these island nations that are susceptible to sea level rise and other effects of climate change. There's a deep embedded relationship with the agenda, the neoliberal agenda, and the environmental issues of climate change, and how climate change is kind of being leveraged as the underlying reason, when actually there's a lot of capitalization happening on those movements. Specifically, populations living in the Pacific Islands are more likely to migrate and resettle than many other communities. So in conclusion, we really think that these issues need to be investigated for cultural plurality, And then just to better understand the role of architecture and planning with vulnerable populations. And I had mentioned to Joseph, James and I were going to go over a bit. We had a speaker drop. So thank you guys for your patience as we got through it. We were really excited to share. Back to you, Joseph.
Yes, as Lindsay mentioned, we went kind of had some expanded time there, but luckily we're still on time by virtue of one missing speaker. Thank you very much for your presentation, both of you. With that, we should move to our final presentation of the session, after which we can then kind of expand and maybe ask questions and do maybe more comparative analysis across the presentations. The last presenter is Mai Yehia, between integration and segregation of new traditions, the case of Syrian refugee settlements in Egypt. Dr. Yehia is an associate professor in the Department of Architectural Engineering and Environmental Design at the Arab Academy of Sciences, Technology in Alexandria, Egypt. She has worked as a senior architect and planner in Egypt and in France. Her work was published by IAU Publications Paris in 2017, titled, and forgive my French, Le Front urbain, un projet pour maîtriser la consommation d'espace, also known as the Urban Edge, a project to control the consumption of space. With that, and we're even still just a little bit ahead of time, the floor is yours. Right.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Joseph, for the introduction. The co-author of my paper is Iman Higazi. She's a PhD candidate in Bauhaus University in Germany. So the title is Between Integration and Segregation of New Traditions, the case of the Syrian refugee settlements in Egypt. The introduction is on identity, rootedness, and territoriality in the context of migration. This is a citation of Simone Weil from her book Le Racinement, translated to English, The Need for Roots. And she says, to be rooted is perhaps the most important and least recognized need of the human soul. It's one of the hardest to define. A human being has roots by virtue of his real, active, and natural participation in the life of a community, which preserves in living shape certain particular treasures of the past and certain particular expectation for the future. So we see here that Simone Weil use the term roots to explain the natural tie between people, places, and identity. But what if these ties are destructed and people lose this connection with their environment, as it's the case in immigrants? So here we will talk about displacement as a loss of identity, but also issues related to exclusion, inclusion, segregation, and integration in the social space. So in times of massive displacements of people around the world and the resulting complexity of relations between the host communities and migrants, between marginalization and integration, identities have been recreated in different forms by who, for a variety of reasons, have had to continue their lives elsewhere. Related to informal urban spaces and the confrontation with the other, where meaning of spaces can be open to contestation and conflict, Doreen Massey characterized space as a process. Here, space involves multiple diverse identities and are defined by interaction with the outside. And thus, spaces are not settled, but continuously demand negotiations. And this is what gives space its creative character and place identity. In this research, the aim is to open up key insights from literature and survey analysis of a particular neighborhood to understand how displaced and migrant Syrian communities recreate their identity and express their traditions in host cities. To examine this topic, it's crucial to understand the factors that shaped urban refugees and to compare their forms of livelihood and coping strategies in central areas versus peripheral ones. So for Altman, the private realm can be understood as a system of layers around individuals to ensure self-protection. But the social realm can create these layers, can change over time. A sense of territoriality originates a sense of belonging and intimacy with a place. Territory reinforces the sense of distinction, privacy, and personal identity. Thus, within this territory, people feel secured. We can see here a picture of the social housing in Masakin Osman in the periphery of the 6th of October city near Cairo. And we can see how residents express their presence in their contact by informal practices. And we can see repainting the facade, for example, is a form of expression against the monotonous environment and against the colorless building blocks that we can see. So Egypt as an urban refuge for Syrians, residency procedures and humanitarian assistance. Since the start of the civil war in 2011, millions of Syrians have been experiencing either forced displacement or migration. Currently, more than 130,000 Syrian refugees and asylum seekers are registered with UNHCR Egypt. But the Egyptian government estimates more than 500,000 people. In Egypt, there are no refugee camps. The Egyptian urban fabric is an open urban refuge, a diversified built environment that embraces Egyptians and Syrians. So we will see now the case study of the 6th of October satellite city, and it's a case study of socio-spatial polarization of the urban space. The methodology employs a neighborhood at the main spatial scale of analysis and focuses on a particular area to facilitate the study of the everyday experience of Syrian residents within the local specificities of the urban space. The wider context is also investigated to emphasize its linkages with wider specialities of the city, focusing on the 6th of October satellite city. The research relies on interviews of the Syrian refugees themselves and experts in services providers such as UNHCR, CARE Egypt, Caritas, or other international and local NGOs. The research also presents the results of focused open-ended interviews, and data have been also gathered from site visits and TV documentaries. So here we can see Cairo, and we can see also the 6th of October city. The satellite city of 6th of October is located about 35 kilometers west of central Cairo and is the settlement that accommodates the highest concentration of Syrian refugees in Egypt. The city offers reasonable accommodation compared to the cost of housing in other downtown areas of Cairo. The city planning is based on a modernist approach with wide spines, grid patterns, and large blocks. Like other new desert cities, the 6th of October city has failed to reach its population targets, and this contributed to the settlement of refugees that found affordable accommodation there. Today, besides its large industrial zone and its 12 residential districts, the city includes several services. The site survey visits helped grasping the clear differences between the central district of 6 of October cities and the areas lying on the city outskirts in terms of accessibility to services and amenities, cleanliness of public spaces, and maintenance of facades. The newcomers in the 6 of October cities are distributed in different districts based on their economic profile, class, city of origin, background, and political engagement. The majority is following family networks, since they came in family and extended family groups from the same origin. Most of the refugees depend on each other and on the UNHCR support and other community-based associations, but also on the generosity of the Egyptian society. Here in the picture, we can see Al Hosari Mosque located in the center of the 6th of October city and its charitable associations. So, longing for territoriality suggested by Altman is represented in the clustering process adopted by the Syrian refugees as a process to ensure self-protection. Based on the density factor, many Syrians have achieved formulating a material expression of owning the space. They got the opportunity to stand out and develop themselves through their individuality, which results in higher self-esteem. The Syrians are proud to display their traditions and identity as shown in the shop facades of the studied area. So here we can see a map where we can see Al Hosari Mosque and an area called Little Syria, and we can see the clustering process adopted by the Syrian community. The area in question has been developing into a socio-economic, cultural, and political hub by and for Syrians that has become busy with various Syrian activities and that can even be considered a Syrian territory named Little Syria. Here it's a zoom in of the two blocks, so we can see at the street level a pedestrian shopping street between the two blocks in a core district with high concentration of Syrian amenities, and they were mapped out and analyzed, and this is a schematic plan of the ground floor of the two buildings in Al Hosari Mosque, and this is a cross section, so you can see that the ground floors, the first and the second floor, are for commercial purposes, and the upper floor are residential. You can see here, this is a comparison between the concentration of the Syrian shops that we can see in red, dark gray, and the local shops in the area. And as we can see, the analysis of the ground floor of the two blocks that triggered the name Little Syria. We can see the two blocks include a total of 52 open commercial shops. More than 63% of the shops are owned by Syrians, and the majority of the activities is related to restaurants and cafe and food related shops owned by Syrians, and the rest are electronic mobiles, electronic supermarkets, and perfume shops also owned by Syrians. So we can see this clustering process which occurred in the area, and we can see that the shop owners used Syrian names to assert their identity, and the quality of the Syrian food and pastry, such as Star of the Levant, Rose of the Levant, Bounties of Damascus, Barakat from Aleppo, and so on. So from the analysis, it's clear that Syrian restaurants, cafe, and food-related shops selling Syrian specialties created a special sense of place in the food court created between the two buildings. In that pedestrian street, due to the welcoming atmosphere, the Syrians have hanged a large billboard that reads in Arabic, "Thank you, Egypt, on behalf of the Syrian community in the Arab Republic of Egypt. We extend our thanks to Egypt, the mother of the world, land, citizens, and government for their good welcome, treatment, and hospitality." So the rents in the 6th of October city has been increasing since the settlement of Syrians, relatively well-off groups, and therefore the renting chances for the poorer refugees were decreasing with tightening options. Of course, the poorer groups are more exposed to struggles and challenges, especially facing their settlement in remote social housing neighborhoods. These areas are characterized by a lack of services, and daily transportation costs are a heavy burden on the poorer groups, which is a problem pertaining to most government subsidized housing projects in Egypt. So here in the map, we can see the district of Al-Hosari Mosque, the center part of the center core of the 6th of October city. And here, this is Beit al-Aila and Masakin Osman, the two social housing neighborhood that will be studied. So the two neighborhoods are examined to understand how the Syrians newcomers navigate the new challenges in their everyday activities and negotiate their location on the periphery of the 6th of October city. There are two social housing projects, Beit al-Aila and Masakin Osman, as we can see on the map. Beit al-Aila, as we can see on this map, unlike the central area of Al-Hosari Mosque, the economic weight of Syrian newcomers on these settlements leads locals to have negative attitude towards them and increases the tension between refugees and locals. But there are also other conflicts based around struggles and competition for power, patronage between the state, religious organization, and NGO. So related to informality as a coping mechanism in remote social housing neighborhoods of the 6th of October city, in Beit al-Aila, we can see different types of informal practices. Small shops on the residential ground floor balconies, bread oven outside a building, vegetables garden, chicken breeding cages on pavement plots, hairdressing with apartments, a daycare facility that occupied a private flat but was extended to the street pavement through a steel cage. And these are informal practices that emerge due to the lack of services in the neighborhood. We can see that in the Beit al-Aila housing, social housing estate, fences and gates surrounding its territory apparently simulate a sense of security in the area and materialize the exclusionary urban space. Moreover, these fences hinder the development of diverse land use. In Masakin Osman, the urban refuge for the Syrian newcomers was facilitated by a faith-based organization that has established its charitable works and set up an office inside a local mosque in 6 October. The organization has its own criteria for accepting Syrians into the areas it controls, as it is called a patronage type of protection. The urban environment in Masakin Osman is much more deteriorated than in Beit al-Aila. The estate is more vast and more populated and dense, and people tend to be more aggressive and suspicious. Moreover, interviewees have pointed out the problems of insecurity that impede free mobility, especially women that are often harassed by thugs. Along the unclean streets, informal kiosks for basic grocery are randomly scattered, but any other amenities are lacking. So refugees wanted to be integrated and merged with others in some urban areas, such as in the case of Al-Hosari Mosque area. While in social housing estate, they kept a low profile, preferred anonymity, and even searched to be hidden. This was noticed during casual conversations and interviews. Some respondents were open and at ease, while many others have refused even talking to the researchers, adopting a certain apprehension, attitude, and mistrust. As such, the more Syrian refugees are socially and economically vulnerable, the more they feel insecure and alienated. In search of social recognition, they have negotiated their ways through new traditions, new mechanisms of coping, and new spatial practices to feel more securely rooted in society, searching for stability and continuity, recovering their repressed histories and identities. Their places of congregation and gatherings provided them with a sense of familiarity. Practices such as cooking, sharing, and profiting from traditional food and listening to Syrian music made them recover a sense of belonging by reviving their roots. Before Syrians' arrival, many scholars have pointed out that the financial feasibility of the 6th of October city was not stable, as it never met its population target. The city's urban sphere was failing to attract residents because of the lack of public amenities. Yet, after the Syrian refugees choosing the 6th of October city as an urban refuge, the city's socio-economic and urban setting have been developing. Syrians were able to gain a recognized position in the Egyptian economy because of their reputation as skilled business persons and employees. The well-to-do among them were able to start their own businesses and provide opportunities to Syrians and Egyptians alike. The Syrian community, concentration, clustering, and its commercial activities and cultural expressions can be considered a catalyst for the once underdeveloped city of 6th of October, thanks to the strong networks between the Syrians and with Egyptians within these islands of freedom. A spatial appropriation took place in the urban space where a collective identity is clearly expressed. With a community of Syrian refugees that has begun to settle in Egypt since nearly 10 years now, a long way is still ahead for them to be fully accepted and recognized, especially in low-income groups environments. However, they proved in many ways that they are active agents of the society and not passive victims whose needs should be considered more effectively. The Egyptian government should reconsider its restrictive measures in terms of visa regime and access to residency for refugees. Empowering provinces in managing migration could address the notable mismatch between an evolving labor market and the location of the labor force. In fact, housing affordability in provinces away of main urban centers, such as the Great Cairo region and Alexandria, can be a driver for starting new urban nodes for development, including new factories and enterprises and new employment opportunity for Egyptians and the displaced community. The spatial polarization of society between rich and poor and the phenomena of uneven development and division of labor cannot be clearer than in the great region of Cairo. The megapolis has showed its capacity to house different displaced communities that could be resettled by establishing networks and relationships to seek livelihood opportunity, and this is truly a lifeline for them. In the 21st century, this is a situation facing many cities of the global south, especially in the Middle East region. This entails a rethinking of their challenges and potentials and of the way researchers understand space, putting in mind that space is not something static and neutral, but it's something intertwined with time to respond to the fundamental and rapid changes that lie ahead in terms of population, urban dynamics, migration, technological and cultural change in cities. Thank you.
Thank you, May, for the very compelling presentation and striking timing, actually. We are right on track in terms of time for our question and answer session. I, as the presenter, or the chair get to kind of marshal this conversation. I have a number of observations and questions prompted by these very compelling and geographically and culturally diverse presentations for sure. I want to perhaps stick to the theme of the session of informality and kind of usurp my top-down power to ask like the first question, all these kinds of things. And instead open it up because I noticed that we also have lots of kind of attendees to the session as well, to allow presenters to ask questions to one another or open the floor to questions from others as well. So I'm going to hold my questions until later and ask you what your thoughts are. Firsthand, Ahmed, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. I enjoyed it very much. I have something to say to Dr. Maya. Okay. First of all, your argument that the 6th of October, first of all, it's not a satellite city. It's not a new town. It's one of the satellite cities. If you go into the differentiation between the new communities, we have satellite cities like the 15th of May and the 6th of October. These are satellite. They depend on Cairo. The new towns are the ones like Burj Al Arab and Sadat or Ashram Ramadan. So this is an important differentiation between the types of the cities. The second, the only city that has reached its planned capacity was the 6th of October. But it was not on the after 25 years of establishing it, it was in the 2016 census. It exceeded the 500,000 population. My third point, there is a differentiation here between the two types of the Syrians, as you have mentioned. One of them are those who are well off, who are able to buy dwellings and put together a business, and the others were not able to do that. And you have to look now, one of the questions that came to my mind, who put that big board thanking Egypt and the government? There must be some connection, okay, between those people at the Hosari and those who are living in the Beit al-Aila and Osman. See what I mean? So the third, my last point before it's about the mechanisms of the informal and why did they go to the 6th of October? 6th of October is growing. It is near settlements like Giza. It's very close to Giza. And it's well connected to Cairo. The government is putting a new motorway to connect it. And so it attracts people to move there, both Egyptians and non-Egyptians. Unlike other settlements towards the east, like Abur or Shuruk, the development there is very slow. Now, if we go back to the history of the Cairo region, the movement is always towards the west. That's where the water is. I mean, the Fatimid Cairo was away near the Muqattam Hill. Then they moved towards the Cairo downtown of Khedive Ismail is to the west, then Zamalek, then Muhandisin, and every time the affluent, Egyptian affluents, are moving, they pull with them some of those poor people putting together those informal settlements because of the kind of the economic and organic relationships between the different social strata. Okay, this is very important explanation for why 6th of October has been growing compared to the other settlements like the 15th of May or the 10th of Ramadan or the Sadat. The further you go away from Cairo and from the downtown Cairo and where the affluence of the greater Cairo region live, the slower the development will take place. 6th of October has regional
These are good points,
services,
Ahmed.
okay?
I want to give
Thank
opportunity to respond.
Yes, thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed El-Kholi, for your comment. I don't understand how you cannot see 6th of October city as a satellite city. It is a satellite city. It's categorized as such in references. It's 35 kilometers.
You said it is a new town. It's not a new town.
I said a satellite city. A satellite city.
Okay.
I mean a new town. If you compare it to Cairo, it's a new town. I know there is more recent towns, of course, now, but it's categorized as a first generation new towns or satellite cities in the Great Cairo region. About the billboard, you asked me who hanged this billboard. It's the Syrian community living in Al-Husari Mosque area, and this is a way of expressing their gratitude to the welcoming atmosphere they found in the area, and because they are free to express their culture, the music, the food,
So why didn't the other Syrians get the same greeting?
In informal areas?
Yeah.
Now this is what I'm talking about in the paper. There is a difference between Syrians in the central area and Syrians in housing subsidized estates. This is what I was explaining, that it's not the same attitude towards the reaction with the Egyptians. As in the central area they are welcomed, but in other areas they tend to be hidden or to be and they prefer anonymity. It's not the same context. Low-income groups don't welcome Syrian refugees, as it's the case in the central area. This is what I'm talking about in the paper.
All right, thank you for your kind of response. I also want to give a kind of opportunity to kind of expand things and address some of the other attendees that have questions. I know Tiago, my good colleague, also has had his hand up for a while. Perhaps it's for perhaps it's for others. Tiago, the floor is yours. Oh.
Hi, Joseph.
Yes, hello.
Very nice to see you. Thanks everyone for your papers, for your presentations. It's I mean, this is a very important topic that you addressed in your papers and in this session. I have a couple of questions specifically for James and Lindsay about their paper. I mean, my first question would be about this issue of architectural adaptations as a form of resistance, and you link this, and rightly so, to, you know, a resistance to a certain kind of colonial rationality that disregards situated practices that, you know, are ancestral or place-based, and this is I think this is a very important argument. But I think, and Maya's paper, I think, asks the question of your cases, which is to what extent are some of these architectural adaptations also class-based? So it's not merely about, you know, let's say, culture, but also about specific class positions. And I think this is probably particularly important in the Philippines case. You know, you see these kinds of adaptations that you showed, which are extremely interesting everywhere in the world. You know, we're in Portugal, for example, we had a prefab housing program in the 70s. You know, all the houses were the same in this neighborhood, so although there were different typologies according to neighborhood. And Rui presented a little bit about this in Coimbra. But if you go to these neighborhoods nowadays, you know, all the houses are different, and they have 2 floors, and they have porches, etc. And so it's very similar to what you showed in the Philippines. And you know, this is very much about, in the Portuguese case, about the specific class position of the people that are living in these neighborhoods, and class-based practices and perceptions of what is the good life and their needs, etc. So this would be one question. The second question is about the statement that you made at the very end of the presentation about, once again, about the Philippines case, about the initial conception of the neighborhood emanating from a neoliberal planning logic. And I was wondering, I mean, what is specifically neoliberal about it? Because, you know, these kinds of resettlement neighborhoods in various shapes have existed, you know, since the early 20th centuries, and they're not necessarily articulated with neoliberal planning logic. So, I mean, I'm just interested in knowing more about how this specific case emanates from a neoliberal planning logic. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiago. I also had very similar questions, but again, I'll allow Lindsay and James to address the questions.
James, you want me to start? You want to add anything?
Sure, you can start.
Okay, so I think, Tiago, you hit the nail on the head. I absolutely agree that this is a class-based scenario, especially in the Philippines, and perceptions of what is a good life in the middle class applied to lower classes. I think, though, to me, what makes the case in the Philippines so stark is the homogeneous nature of the settlements as being exactly the same, and then you're able to see the adaptations in such contrast with their previous intended design. But it's not only class-based. I think, you know, there could even be expansion upon that about how the resettlement reproduces the class, right? That there could be an argument that the adaptations are a form of, at least to these people and these families, of improving their class and improving their conditions, and that the entire process of resettlement is a form of reproduction of that class, because that whole process has to get started again under new conditions. And I would even argue, in the Pabahai case, conditions that were much more difficult, harder to find a job, harder to create community networks and cohesion, et cetera. So I think there's something really rich to that comment. So I appreciate it. I think we could also have endless conversations about what is neoliberalism. Is there a neoliberal architecture? Is there, and that would be really fun. We should do that as a conference. But I think we tried to stick more to the idea of neoliberalism as an ideology that elevates economic models and kind of the economic cost benefits over all other considerations. And I think there are similarities. There are other resettlement programs that have happened throughout the Philippines history that obviously considered economic benefits. That's absolutely true. But were there others that made such decisions that that was the ultimate priority at the expense of other considerations? And I do think I have ground to stand on to argue that that is the case. And I would give two reasons. One because I was able to find documentation when I interviewed the Housing and Land Use Board about their decision-making process. And they very clearly stated that their decision about materials, about design and planning was purely based on numbers of families in the amount of acreage, and that they had modified BP, which is BP 220, which is their architectural code that puts requirements on social housing, to allow more units to go into a certain amount of acreage and limit the amount of public space applied in order to get those cost reductions. So there's very clearly an evidence trail showing that economic priorities were elevated from the late 80s, early 90s, and became really a rigorous part or the main part of any design process. And the second evidence, I think, is that there was a new law added, and the number is escaping me, but that essentially said that these resettlement communities were now going to be tied to the financial responsibilities of private companies. So it was no longer just about a specific presidential campaign allocating a certain amount of land that was held in public trust. It was about how could the government leverage the economic potential of that land by creating a tax base with private industry, and then get private industry to pay for social housing. And so I think it's both the change in the housing laws and the design process, but it's also about this new mechanism that's very neoliberal in nature that requires private industry to now subsidize or pay for public housing. James?
And as far as the Marshall Islands, in response to the first question, I don't think it's necessarily, I wouldn't say it's a class. I wouldn't say there's a direct correlation between class and adaptations. It would fall under any spectrum. I certainly would say that, you know, those of higher class have more of the social mobility or economic mobility to make the decisions, maybe based on their own identification to culture, whereas lower class families, in particular those coming from outer atolls, have less. They rely on the social safety nets, so they have to kind of adapt their environments to meet those needs. Or I shouldn't say have to, but it's more of a pressing necessity. But yeah, I wouldn't say there's a correlation.
Thank you, Lindsay and James. I even have more questions about that. But I also want to make attendees to this kind of session that we have about 3 minutes until a kind of official conference break. But I see that there is a question from Mark Gillum. Lucky to have him here. Mark, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, Joseph, great job moderating. Wonderful session. I really appreciated the graphics and the discussion of methodology in the presentations to help us understand where you're coming from. My question is to Pamini, and it has to do with your, I think it was your last slide, and you asked a question in your slide, will digital platforms replace physical spaces? So this is a simple yes, no question. So maybe it would be better to think about, you know, broadening that. Certainly digital platforms have replaced Nottingham for this conference, but I guess in your research, Pamini, in social media of refugees, where you're looking, how have digital platforms replaced physical spaces?
Specifically to my research, I would say that there's a problem of data limitation, that I cannot see the representation of many places in those Twitter data. I think so. Like for in the paper, I further elaborate the limitation of the data set that I acquired from limited to Utica, which I'm not sure if if the using social media is part of the lifestyle of people in such a small town or not. So in this case, I would say I cannot conclude directly from my research. Mm-hmm.
Well, it might be worth looking into in the future. You know, how does social media change the physical places for refugee settlements? Would be helpful. And we need to run to another break session, but thanks so much, everybody. And we'll see you at the other side.
I again appreciate all the presentations and the topics that were raised. Presentations were fascinating, to say the least. I'm glad we had a little extra time, particularly to Lindsay and James's kind of expanded kind of conversation and the questions that it raised to everyone. If you don't mind, I just have one last question, particularly to James and Lindsay. And I suppose it's related to Tiago's question, but you would use this phrase quite often, right? Where it was about, there seemed to be this resurgence of cultural patterns, right? In the built environment, which I take to mean more kind of indigenous or kind of localized forms that again are acting as those kinds of forms of resistance. I do wonder, quote unquote, what that impetus is, right? So Lindsay used the term that there was a kind of impetus that was catalyzing this this resistance, and I wonder, like, does it always take something, quote unquote, negative or top down to kind of be the impetus to propel these acts of resistance, right? Like where is that? Where is the agency there, right? Like, is the agency one of like a kind of fight and defensive kind of act of you know, cultural agency, or is it if that had not been there, it would probably take different forms for sure. But like I just wonder what that is. I mean, I guess in some sense that's a question to all of the presenters, right? Like that there seems to be some outside top-down force, perhaps neoliberal capital, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of vaporous, that is pushing these things. But does it take that in order to spur these kind of moments of kind of creative practice and adaptation that really occurred across the presentation? And I realize we're going into break time, but maybe that's like a kind of closing thing that people can address collectively.
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. Brings up I think a lot of interesting discussions and points. I'm just thinking, I mean, I think part of the, you know, terming resistance, resurgence, whatnot is based on our own interpretations and kind of somewhat projecting our own logics to what we're observing as we do in research. I know colleagues of mine, First Nations and in Ontario, they tend to move away from the use of resurgence or resistance and really just talk about continuation. And I think that's an important way to look at the Marshall Islands as well, where, you know, it really is a continuation of cultural practices in place, land-based systems that, you know, they were essentially paved over with development, mostly by the Japanese and American presence there. And it's just what we started seeing highlighted in particular in the 90s and then into the early 2000s was that rapid resurgence in this essence that it started to overcome that you know, American built development. But it was always there, and that's what we see certainly on the outer atolls, that it was always there. It just maybe we weren't looking for it, perhaps.
Agreed. I find the same in my own research. Any others? Okay. With that, we will close this session, and I hope to kind of see you, yes, virtually, perhaps in other sessions today and in the following days. But once again, to be in 3D with each other in real physical reality, because, you know, the replacement, the magic of technology is pretty amazing, but I still miss shaking everyone's hand, right? Seeing everyone's face. So long. Thank you again for your presentations, and I'll see you in the future.